And I think that that's enough of that silliness. So I'm going to introduce our two authors, and then we're going to jump in and have our conversation. Kate Winkler Dawson is a seasoned documentary producer whose work has appeared in the New York Times, WCBS News, and ABC News Radio, Fox News Channel, United Press International, PBS NewsHour, and Nightline. She is the author of both Death in the Air, the true story of a serial killer, the Great London Smog, and the Strangling of a City, and also the more recent American Sherlock, which I don't have the subtitle for here. Kate, what's your amazing subtitle for American Sherlock? Something about CSI?
It's always got, there's always murderers in the title.
Forensics?
It's Murder, Forensics, and the Birth of American CSI.
Good job. And she teaches journalism at the University of Texas and has so many other cool things that are about to happen, I believe, that she'll probably share with us. But everybody, please, in the chat box, give it up. Welcome, clap, clap, clap for Kate Winkler Dawson, who we're so glad to have here. And then we also have Wes Ferguson, a senior editor for Texas Monthly and author of The Blanco River from Texas A&M University Press and Running the River, Secrets of the Sabine. He's been praised for his sly humor and generous heart. He's a 2019 inductee in the Texas Institute of Letters. He's a former managing editor of Texas Highways, the official travel magazine of Texas, and he's written for several newspapers and magazines covering Bigfoot sightings, business and environmental issues, and backyard wrestling. I like this, so I'm going to say it. He also briefly taught snow skiing in Australia. A graduate of the University of Texas at Austin, where he worked for the Daily Texan, Ferguson grew up in the Piney Woods community of Liberty City, and he got a start at the Flare, the student newspaper of Kilgore College. Ferguson's groundbreaking profile of a miniature horse farm was chosen by the National Newspaper Association as the top business feature of 2014. In addition to his writing for Texas Monthly, this is a current bio, right? He's working on a book about El Camino Real de los Tejas National Historic Trail.
I am. Yeah, it's been kind of languishing because when I went back to work full time, but I'm taking leave from Texas Monthly later this summer to
Cool.
wrap it up.
Well, we are glad that we could just make you feel some additional pressure about that. And I also know that were you just very recently nominated, is this correct, for the National Magazine Award for feature writing for a piece that you did for Texas Monthly recently, right?
Correct.
Yeah, Pam Perloff was really bragging about you a lot. So I want to say a big thank you to you too, Wes, then for joining us and for being here for this conversation. No pressure, but you both are representing all nonfiction. So, so speaking of that, I would just love, I think that when I think of nonfiction writers that I really admire, even though they're writing about varied topics, often, there's something about a particular voice that I think you attach to, right? And you get used to the style of somebody who writes nonfiction in a way that is captivating, and that you kind of come to expect that whatever the topic might be, you're going to get a certain something from them. And I would love for you each, and I'm sure this is probably not your favorite thing to talk about, but for each of you to describe to me what that is for you. When you think about who you are as a nonfiction writer, what are those little pieces to it, the little sort of ways that you would describe your writing that make it so uniquely your own? I'm gonna start with you, Kate, because your face is very big on my screen right now, so you get to start.
Oh, uniquely my own. Well, I think it starts in my genre, which is historical true crime. So I think that automatically I've always thought of my job as somebody who has transitioned from doing documentaries into writing books, as being a translator of everything that I'm seeing in the archive, all the photos I'm seeing, all the locations I'm going to that help me build this world. Like, my challenge is building that world in the book. So for the first book, Death in the Air, it was about the Great Smog of 1952, and it happened during a certain time period. And I went to London during that exact time period to kind of feel the cold. So I have been working really hard on, taking what I think are, for me, very visceral moments that I'm living, trying to replay how this would have happened 60 years, 100 years ago, and then translating that to the page. And I also am a huge, like, for someone who has 2 children and is married and has numerous jobs, I watch an obscene amount of television, like procedural television. So I love opening and closing scenes that are really strong, that are riveting. And so I really have been trying to work on those. Like every chapter has a really strong feeling of a visual, something visual that's happening that I'm able to interpret on the page, and then leaving with kind of a cliffhanger, but also something that's really visual. So that's what I'm going toward.
I love it. And you're sort of coming straight off of the session that I was in before this, which was talking about historical fiction. And yeah, there is, I don't really think of that, or I hadn't thought of that before, that is your category, right? Sort of historical nonfiction. Wes, how about you? What is your, what makes a story Wes Ferguson's story for the folks who have gotten to know you as a nonfiction writer?
Well, I would say, I have, long before I became a journalist or a nonfiction author, I just really loved stories, the kind you tell around a campfire, the children's books I read as a kid. And so I got into journalism as a way to just keep engaging with stories and just having fun. And all my editors were saying, you can't just write a fun story. It's got to be useful. It's got to be informative. And so for me, I just learned to kind of add that in to satisfy the editors. And so when you read one of my books, it's mostly play and it's just having fun, and you learn a little bit along the way. My first book was about the Sabine River in my hometown, and I didn't really have my own voice. I just knew that I really liked this book by Bill Bryson called A Walk in the Woods, and I knew that it had been very successful. And I just kind of tried to rip him off. I tried to, I kind of followed his structure a little bit, and the journey that he took with his friendship and traveling the Appalachian Trail. But for me, it was boating down the river. And, he kind of hits all these notes along the way. And so I was like, okay, well now I need to write about getting ready for my trip, because he wrote about his, and thinking about a story arc, and at some point it's you reach your high and then you come crashing down. So I would say for me, it's mostly about just having fun and having a good story, and you learn a little bit along the way.
So then let's talk about crafting that story. I guess actually I want to start first with the idea, the spark of the idea, because for nonfiction, this is obviously true for fiction too, but and I imagine for both of you during your careers, it's not been so much about, it hasn't every time been the spark of the idea coming from you, because you've worked for editors and people who have assigned their spark of an idea to you, or it's come through a different process. But I would love to hear, since so many of the folks who are listening are probably writing book form, nonfiction, book length. When does that idea become a real tangible, this could be a book and not just another of the millions of great ideas that I'm sure you each have pop into your heads every day? So Kate, I'll start with you. When do you know idea versus, yes, this should be a book?
Well, I love that you describe it as a spark of an idea. I don't know if I've ever had that. I think I've had 1,000 broken matches and just willed a fire to start, because I've written a book's length worth of book proposals. I've written, I think, 8 book proposals, and 2 have been sold and 1 is preparing to be sold. So I understand what it's like to put together a narrative nonfiction or even a nonfiction book proposal. It is an endeavor. And so I have gotten to the point where I have a checklist of things that, for me, things that have to be checked off in order for me to even approach my agent, who asks the same questions over and over and over again of me before she will say, okay, I think you should do the proposal. So for me, I think it's probably 4 or 5 ones. So it has to be an idea or a story that has been really underreported. I'm never going to do a book on JFK. I'm not going to do something that's really well known. I like the hidden gems. It has to be about a person or an event or something that changed history significantly. Or with my last book, the most recent book, American Sherlock, I mean, an entire career of being a forensic scientist and how that's changed. And then it has to be a time period and an area of the country or a country that's appealing to me. So the first book was 1950s London, which is completely fascinating to me because it's not the Blitz and it's not the Beatles. It's somewhere in nasty and dirty in between. And then the second book was 1920s San Francisco area, which is the best decade I could have picked because it's Prohibition, it's Roaring Twenties, it's the Depression. And so I have to be able to live in that world for a really long time. And so it needs to be somewhere. I tend to gravitate towards cities where I've lived because I like where I've lived. And so the next book is going to be set in New York. And really, to me, the top most important thing is that I have to have the right resources. I have to have an archive that, like, when I walk into this archive, it has to feel like so overwhelming that I don't think I'm going to be able to get through it in the 6 days that I've booked to stay at this hotel. That to me means I will have the letters, the diaries, the firsthand sources, everything that I'll need to build conversations that really happened. And so in the second book in particular, I was able to do that. I had this forensic scientist. He had a massive archive at Berkeley with 100 boxes. His son had an archive, his best friend had an archive, his sidekick had an archive, and so I was able to create these letters that were really great. Like, you could see the conversations based on these letters, but without a really strong archive and a lot of strong sources, I can't ever lean on somebody else's stuff. It has to be real and intangible and firsthand.
What's going to happen to all those archives, as we move further into the world of,
I don't know,
email? And just a follow-up question, and then I'm going to jump over to you, Wes. But Kate, someone did ask, and I think this is a great follow-up. So what are those questions that your agent asks you? What are those questions that your agent wants answered?
Why do we have to talk about that?
Too soon?
He says, oh gosh, it's like, it is literally the same thing. I might as well I have a sticky note that has all of her questions. So usually it is things like, okay, well, how did it significantly change history? They always want to know, I call it the WTF factor. My agent's classier than that. It's the why now factor. Mm-hmm. Why do we care about this story now? Why does it, and how does it resonate with the current audience? So my first book was about air pollution and wrongful conviction. The second book is about forensics and how we're sort of derailed by bad science now, and we were then. So those are really her two big things. And then my editor wants to know that. She assumes, I've used this will be the third book that I'm signing up with the same editor at Putnam. And she always wants to know about the person. So, Kate, do you have all the letters that show that he's a jerk, then show that he's really nice, that show that, that give you this view of a well-rounded person? So the second book about the American Sherlock, my editor wanted to know, well, does he have like a Watson? Does he have a Inspector Lussard? I mean, is there a Moriarty? like I can magically make these things appear. Luckily, he did have all of those things, but it's it's a high bar, and so I just get used to saying those questions over and over in my head and answering before I get to a point where I approach my agent.
I think that is such valuable advice for folks who are listening, because it really is a high bar. And for them, for your agent, she knows that it's a high bar that she has to meet for editors. And then for your editor, she knows for the readers who are going to be expecting, who want to attach to a character, who want to feel like they're really getting the full world, who want it to connect with their own lives in some way. That is really super helpful.
And I will say, let me say one quick thing about that, because that reminds me. So readers are obviously really important, but I also know that the news peg for nonfiction is really important. My editor wants to know, why would All Things Considered want to interview you? Why would Fresh Air want to review the book? Why would the New York Times? It's got to be a big, for at least for what I do, it needs to be significant in order to catch the attention of these major outlets that will then bring thousands of people into the book, we hope.
Mm-hmm. Well, and because the world is so competitive just in terms of what books are being published, that you really have to stand up or stand out in the crowd. So Wes, what about you? Tell us about that sort of creative idea spark to actually committing. Also, that's another thing, especially, in nonfiction and fiction, but committing the time, committing the energy, committing the resources to something that sometimes you're not even sure the payoff is going to be there at the start, right?
Right.
Whereas with fiction, at least you get to know, okay, if I can do this right, I can give them the payoff. So what does that look like for you?
So I will say that Kate is both much more sophisticated and accomplished at this than, because I've been working with a couple agents on a couple proposals and haven't really cracked that code yet. But for the books that I have written and that I hope to, it usually starts with magazine assignments, which is a luxury that I have as a journalist. I can write the story, and a lot of times, after 2,000 words or 5,000 words, that story has been told and I'm ready to move on. But if there's still something there, something that I want to continue to explore, then that's when I would know that I would want to keep chipping away at that. I also, just from a very practical standpoint, as someone who until recently was like just really poor, like I needed to get money. And so my second and my forthcoming third book, the impetus was really like, how can I get a grant? Like I know I want to write a book. I know that I can enjoy myself on a lot of different subjects, but what's the one that I could write a grant and get some money? And so I, for my second and third book, I got, grants to basically have like a year's salary. And they're both, like the first one I got money for was about a river in the Blanco River in the Hill Country. The next one is about the Camino Real, the first trail across Texas. So it was easy to get the money for those, but also there's not a lot of commercial potential for those. They're both very like regional books. So I'm trying to figure out how to make the next step to be where Kate is. And the agent, the one I've been working with most recently, I would say a lot of the questions that she has are like, she's like, I'm trying to see what this is like on the page, which I think she's trying to see how, like, what I've written, how that will be translated into, a full, book. And the other agent that I've been working with, he's very specific in like what the kind of books he likes. And it's like, it needs to have more like violence, and it is like, it needs to have some big cliffhanger that ends with like someone about to get killed. And then it's also like, it's on the Camino Real, the trail. And he's like, well, have you thought about like, traveling the trail in some kind of gimmicky way, like riding a mule or something? I'm like, I don't want to do that. So I got to say, I don't really have a very satisfying answer, but I'm right there with everyone else in the room who's trying to figure this out together.
Oh, this answer is great, because I've got a couple follow-ups. So the first one being, and I'm sure this has popped into many people's heads, where's the grant money coming from? So can you tell us that process for a nonfiction writer when you're looking, where do you even begin to find grants that might help you do what you've been able to do for those couple of projects?
I would say that I've looked at, nonprofit foundations in Texas that have funded other projects that are like, somewhat related. For the Blanco River book, I got a grant from a private foundation, and the director lives on that river. And I was like, well, he's probably going to be, willing to pay for a book about his backyard river. And then because my books have like strong environmental components, and there's a lot of history, there's a lot of organizations out there that make grants for like historical related projects. And especially like as my credentials have improved, it's been easier to like make connections with the people that dole out the money. The only really sticky part is they never give money directly to individuals, so I have to partner with another nonprofit group as kind of a middleman. Mm-hmm. Both of my first two books were published by A&M Press, but they were sponsored by the Meadows Center for Water and the Environment in San Marcos, which is part of Texas State University. And so the grants went to that, went through Texas State University, and then they paid me.
So I love that you're mentioning this, though, because I don't think it's something that comes up very often, at least in the conversations I have with nonfiction writers, and especially if you're writing regional, or if you're writing about a very specific topic that could have, some sort of foundation or nonprofit backing. I think that's really valuable that you brought.
I don't know anyone else who really does it, and it's been very beneficial to me.
Yeah, that's cool. And then the other thing that you said that I think is also such an interesting and maybe sometimes frustrating, but a big part of the nonfiction side of things versus fiction, is that the expectation is you sell a book on a nonfiction proposal, right? And so often our agents are actually agents are not just reviewing a manuscript and determining, where you might cut this or move this or what have you. They're actually at the very early process of the shaping of that project. And so for you, Wes, you were talking to an agent who just wasn't was injecting or wanting to put their own interests into it, but probably wasn't the right fit for it because it wasn't what you wanted to do. And you probably bump up against that, I would guess, more on the nonfiction side. Someone's asking why you were working with two different nonfiction agents, and I'm just curious, is that why?
Well, I've talked to agents who said, like, I want to be exclusive, and you only work with me. But for these other people, they didn't care. It was like project specific. So like I have an agent for the Camino Real book, and then I'm working with a different agent on a different project that's kind of based around my hometown in East Texas. And but I've run into the same thing both times. It's like really unable to agree on like what the book should look like. Mm-hmm. And for my most recent one, I got a lot of like awesome feedback from a lot of writers, that Texas-based writers that y'all would recognize. They're like, this is great, this is awesome. And then then you show it to the agent, and she's like, no way, why don't you like make it completely different? And then you're like trying to reconcile that. But I've also talked to people who say, give the agent what she wants and then write the book you want. And I don't really know if that is how well that would pay off, but people have told me that just do what they want and then
sleight of hand.
Right. Yeah.
Well, and then, of course, in the nonfiction world, what happens next is you work with that agent to continue to craft that proposal, because the agent in turn sells the proposal to a publisher. And then suddenly you have an editor in this situation who says, maybe takes you right back to the book you wanted to be writing, but saw a spark of an idea that worked for them. I love it. Kate, did you have something you wanted to add to that part of the conversation?
No, I think that the proposal process is really difficult. It's still the worst thing for me ever. Specifically, the chapter summaries is the worst part ever, where you have to, it feels like you're committing, for those of you, I don't know where you guys are in the process of a proposal, if you've gotten that far, if you've learned this, but part of the nonfiction proposal is you give a short 1 to 2 page summary per chapter of what's going to happen in that chapter. And I have historically wanted to explain every detail of the book ever in each of those chapter summaries, and they're too long and they're too detailed. And so crafting a nonfiction book proposal is in itself a craft. It really is hard to do. It's very difficult to me, even compared to writing the book, because you have to be really succinct and you're not doing as much research because, until I get the advance on the book, I can't commit to going to London or going to San Francisco or any of these places. And so I think an agent, I was just lucky. I had an agent, I did what Wes did. I had an agent before. He was into wars. I didn't want to do anything on wars. I tried a Civil War pitch. I didn't want to do it. And so I talked to Becca, and she recommended a different agent for me who has been fantastic and I love. And and who is a friend now, a good friend, as is my editor. And I think it was finding, and these were both two good agents. I mean, they're both very successful agents. But the agent that I have now, I think, understands me a little bit better, and she understands what my skill set is, and she enjoys selling my books. And now I've pulled her into these crazy worlds of podcasts and TV series and stuff. So it's been a really good experience. But the agent author relationship is in some ways as complicated as I think the author editor relationship. At least, it had been in the past for me. So finding the right fit, it has been really important for me.
Well, and I'm going to stay with you, Kate, for a second, because another thing that comes up often and repeatedly in nonfiction conversations is that idea of platform, of how there's so much pressure put on nonfiction authors of books to have a built-in audience already when they sell a book, to be able to reach a certain audience, to be gung-ho self-promoters. And I would just love to hear your experience coming from, pretty whirlwind last few years for you as an author, in that both of your books have published in the last probably, 4 years?
3 years.
3 years?
Yeah, from 17 and then 19, yeah.
So talk about that, just the platform part of it, the building your readership, and then also I think what's happening with you is so interesting in terms of the podcast. Can you, and whatever you can talk about for that.
Okay. So I'll try to keep it brief because I want to hear what Wes has to say also about branding and all that. I've never liked that word, but it really fits with what I think I've seen my friends who are really successful authors have been able to do. So what I thought about probably about a year and a half ago was, maybe 2 years ago, when Death in the Air first came out, it was reviewed everywhere, and including the New York Times Book Review. It did well. It wasn't outstanding. It did well. And then the New York Times Book Review mentioned the paperback right before Christmas, the paperback version of my book, as one of 3 books that they recommended, which is a huge deal. And I think it was a bump of maybe 200 books, 300 books, which for some might seem great, but if you're with a big publishing house right before Christmas, that's not a big bump. And that's when I realized that I don't know if traditional media is what I can lean on to sell a lot of books. And so I started listening to more and more podcasts, and I realized that with my background as a documentary filmmaker, I have this folder on my desktop that's literally called Failed Books. So, it's so sad. It's things that I remember, the 5 other ones that never sold. So I'm turning them into podcasts, into 6-part narrative, documentary style, like what you would hear on Wondery, Dirty John, except a little classier. So, I am trying to turn my story ideas that don't quite make it to a book because of whatever reason, they aren't timely enough or something, and I'm able to turn them into a podcast because the readership for the network, or the listenership for the network that I'm going to be on, I can't really talk about it, but the show that is the headliner of this network that I'm signing with is basically the biggest true crime podcast on the planet. And they have a massive, massive audience. and they all buy books. And so that is a true crime. That is when you're thinking about getting your audience, who is your audience? If you're writing about the Civil War, where is your Civil War audience? Where are the people that are going to sign up for your newsletter, that are going to follow you around, that are going to follow you on Twitter? Like, that is my audience. 30 something million, many times women who listen to true crime. So I now have an audience that doesn't have to buy anything in order to hear my voice, to connect with me, and to connect with one of my stories. And so this podcast is going to launch, it looks like, at Halloween, right before my paperback comes out with American Sherlock. And so it all sort of, works together. I also can't really say much about this, but American Sherlock, the last book, is going to be like a Netflix series. We just signed the contract on it. A documentary series, which is cool. That will be me on camera, talking about these cases. That's all part of my branding, as cheesy as that is. That's me as this historian.
Awesome.
Well, I mean, it is, but it's like, I feel a little, it's just how I tell the stories and how they can stretch over all these different genres has been really interesting. But it's trying to find my audience, how to reach them, how to keep them interested, and how to get them to buy books, but also just, to connect with people.
Yeah. Well, and for you, it's, I think when as a nonfiction writer, you move into other spaces like podcasts or television documentaries, you really are, you're right, you're transitioning from subject-based readership into more cult of personality, for lack of a better way of saying it, and people also just trusting that those stories and that you're going to share them with them in a way that is digestible and that's interesting. Wes, for you, what do you think about with, and I love that we're talking to both of you, because I think that you each are successful. You each have amazing Wes, like all the national magazine awards want to do is give you awards, it seems. And so you are just so, just awarded in terms of your nonfiction that you're writing, and you are working for one of my favorite magazines, and I think a lot of folks who are watching this favorite magazines, Texas Monthly. What do you think about when you think about building your own platform or reaching readers beyond the readers of Texas Monthly, but the readers who are going to come to that magazine because they see your name on it? What does that look like for you?
Well, first, Kate, congrats on the Netflix deal. That's awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, I want everything that she's doing, not what I'm doing.
Not at the same time is my recommendation.
Right, yeah. I would say, so like you said, not about other than Texas Monthly, but I will say that having Texas Monthly behind me is massive, and Texas Monthly is making a lot of strides to go into a bunch of different platforms. Like a lot of our stories are becoming podcasts and movies and Netflix shows, like The Tiger King. That's going to be like a Nicolas Cage movie at some point, because we wrote about it before the Netflix show. For me personally, for my books, which on a kind of really small time level, academic press stuff, I'm not a natural public speaker. Like, I became a writer because I'm not that eloquent, and I'm kind of an introvert, and so I force myself to always agree to do stuff like this, because it gets easier every time. And I also I've done like the local library circuit, where you go to like, hey, you talk to like the senior citizens in Burnett, and that kind of thing. And I find that I sell enough books doing that to make it worth my while. For the first book, I went to a lot of like, author events where you just sit there with like a stack of books, and that did not really, I made some nice connections, and I actually met some Writers League folks at the book festival, but for me, being actually like the center of attention, like giving a presentation, and it's all about me, but a lot of these places, they have a built-in audience, and so to tap into that has been worth my while, and it's gotten my name and my book out there. Like every little town has a little library, and most of them do have these like monthly writer sessions, and And so that has worked for me. I've sold a lot of books on my own. That's another, like, common complaint you always hear, like, the publisher is not marketing your book like like you would. And so, and I also make a lot more money when I sell the book myself, as opposed to when I just get a royalty from it. So that has been worth my time to go out and hustle.
Well, and I love that you're saying that as well, because I think for folks who are writing, especially if you're writing something that is particularly interesting to a particular region, right? And if it's all of Texas, going into smaller communities and reaching people where they're at is such a smart thing to do. And I'll just publicly invite you to be a part of our library program that we do, where we send authors into libraries to talk to folks. So we'll talk about that later,
Okay.
when we can go into libraries again.